Hello, my name is Dr. Paul Connett. I'm Professor of Chemistry at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. For 2.5 years, my wife and I have been intensely reviewing the literature on fluoride and the fluoridation of the public drinking water. In May of 1998, I had the good fortune to be in New Zealand, and whilst I was there, I had the opportunity to interview Dr. John Colquhoun. Dr. Colquhoun was the former Principal Dental Officer for Auckland, and he had been an avid supporter and promoter of fluoridation in New Zealand for many years. He has subsequently changed his position, and I urge you, if you know anybody, doctor, dentist, neighbor, anybody who is pro-fluoridation, please get them to look at this videotape. Hopefully they too will change their position.
In 1948 I graduated at the University of Otago in dentistry, and immediately afterwards I went to the far north of our country to a sparsely populated, undeveloped area where there was no electricity, and using a caravan and a foot treadle dental drill I brought the final 6 schools in New Zealand under the treatment of the New Zealand School Dental Service. Well, after that I was teaching and administering in the School Dental Service for several years, and in 1955, at the age of 51, I went into general dental practice in Auckland. Then in 1967 I went back into the School Dental Service, the Department of Health, and after a period of teaching again I became Principal Dental Officer in Auckland, which, as you know, is New Zealand's largest city. And during that time I was a very keen and earnest advocate of water fluoridation. You see, my experience both in practice and in the School Dental Service was of the appalling level of tooth decay among the child population and the adults, of course. And fluoridation seemed to offer a very dramatic and easy way to we read the literature, and of course during my training as a dentist I had heard only one side of the fluoridation scientific controversy. In fact, I believed there was no real scientific controversy, that the evidence was overwhelmingly in support of the measure, and only sort of ignorant lay people and a few crackpot professionals were foolish enough to oppose it. And I recall how when I was elected to a local government here in Auckland, and the subject of fluoridation, this was before we had fluoridation, the subject came up, and I argued very fiercely, and I now regret rather arrogantly, as a young professional who thought he knew it all, and poured scorn on a lay member of the council who had been persuaded against water fluoridation. And I persuaded the mayor and the majority of my councillors to support the addition of fluoride to our drinking water. I was not only a keen advocate, I had published material in the professional literature in support of fluoridation. When I became a Principal Dental Officer in Auckland, I had access to the treatment records of all the children. You see, the School Dental Service in New Zealand treated almost all children, 98% of them. So we had dental decay figures for every child in our community. Not, as in many fluoridation studies, a sample here and a sample there, which you make a random selection for, but every child. And I demonstrated that there had been a dramatic reduction in tooth decay since we had introduced fluoride to our water supply. And I attributed the decline to the addition of fluoride, which you'd think was a reasonable enough thing to do, at least I thought it was. And I found that the greatest benefit seemed to have come to the low-income areas. And this study of mine was published in the Dental Journal. Now, I said in that study that treatment statistics of that nature were a valid measure of child dental health in our population. And my professional colleagues accepted that, and that study is cited approvingly in the official history of the New Zealand Dental Association. Now, I was so successful as an advocate of water fluoridation that my superiors in Wellington approached me and asked me to make a world study tour, undertake a world study tour on fluoride research and the subject of water fluoridation, which I agreed to do. At the end of this tour, I was to come back and become the health department's expert on fluoridation and lead a campaign to introduce water fluoridation to those parts of New Zealand which had resisted having it added to their water.
Now, do you remember what year that was?
That was 1980 that I went on the World Study Tour.
Okay. And which countries did you go to?
Well, I went to Australia, North America, Britain, several European countries, and Asia. So I was away 4 months. Mm-hmm. Now, I should explain that before I left, my superiors confided to me some worries they were having about the effects of fluoridation in New Zealand. You see, that from the records they were now gathering, as I had earlier gathered in Auckland, the treatment records of children in New Zealand, they were very surprised to find that tooth decay was declining as much in the non-fluoridated places as it was in the fluoridated areas. But they felt that if they started to collect more comprehensive data, figures for every child, instead of as they had been collecting samples from different communities, that this would show that there was a better state of oral health in the fluoridated areas than the non-fluoridated areas. They agreed that it wouldn't be the 50 or 60% difference which we had claimed would result from introducing water fluoridation, but that there would be a significant difference nonetheless. Now, I accepted that readily, being a keen pro-fluoridationist, and when I went on the tour, I found the same thing was happening in other countries. It was confided to me that there wasn't the difference between the fluoridated and non-fluoridated areas which they expected. But again, they felt that more thorough and comprehensive surveys would show that there was a significant difference, because they were convinced, as I was convinced, that fluoridation must be the most effective way to reduce tooth decay. Now, when I returned home, I was expounded the views of the researchers I met. You see, they thought, as my superiors in New Zealand had thought, that the decline in the non-fluoridated areas must be due to the increased use of fluoride toothpastes, fluoride supplements, clinical uses of fluoride, and we had done all these things in New Zealand in the school dental clinics. And this satisfied us that the lesser difference was due to that, and that we were sure we could show that water fluoridation was better than these other methods. Of course, when we had been advocating fluoridation, we had told the public that water fluoridation was the only way to effectively reduce tooth decay. However, we satisfied ourselves with this argument. Now, I realise now, of course, that I and my colleagues were doing what professionals have done throughout the history of science when their pet theory is suddenly challenged with evidence which is embarrassing to them. We fell over backwards to explain away the evidence. Now, when I got back, I was duly appointed chairman of a National Fluoridation Promotion Committee, and our task was to see that all New Zealand was fluoridated as soon as possible. Now, to do that, of course, I had to gather information and data, and the first thing I did was to have a look at the treatment statistics that had been gathered from my own district compared to the non-fluoridated part of the district. And these new statistics, incidentally, were collected while I was away, When I got back, I had a look at them. And to my astonishment, there were fewer fillings needed in the non-fluoridated part of Auckland than in the fluoridated.
Fewer
fillings, yes. Which, as you can imagine, to a keen fluoridator, that caused some concern. So I contacted the districts to the north and the south of me and asked the principal dental officers there for their figures which had been collected. And they showed the same picture. It wasn't such a big difference, but the teeth was slightly better in the non-fluoridated part of the district than in the fluoridated part. So I then decided to ask my superiors in Wellington to supply me with the figures for the whole country, which they had collected, as I knew when they were away, and these figures were sent to me. The treatment statistics for all children, all 12 and 13-year-old children in New Zealand, from every health district in the country. And written across the top of the list was an instruction to me that the figures were not to be made public. And when I examined them, I believe now I realise why that instruction was there. In most of the health districts of New Zealand, the percentage of children who had perfect teeth had required no treatment at all. That percentage was greater in the non-fluoridated part of the district than in the fluoridated part. More children with perfect teeth in the non-fluoridated area than the fluoridated area. And that was true for most of the health districts of New Zealand. That was in the year 1981, the year after I returned from my study tour. Well, I had been instructed when I was appointed chairman of this Fluoridation Promotion Committee to tell the members of my profession and the public that teeth were better in the fluoridated areas than they were in the non-fluoridated areas. Well, I did not carry out that instruction. Instead, I wrote to my colleagues in North America who had told me that they were carrying out similar large-scale surveys and asked them for the results of those surveys.
Now, would that have been the National Institute of Dental Research?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I had interviewed them when I was there, and they told me that they felt sure that this new survey would show the benefits of fluoridation. Incidentally, they were never published at that stage, and they didn't answer my letter. Years later, of course, Dr. John Colquhoun in America used the official information legislation in America,
Freedom of Information Act.
Freedom of Information Act,
yeah,
to extract that information. And then he published a paper in Fluoride, a journal which I now edit, showing that there was virtually no difference in the decay rates in the fluoridated and the non-fluoridated parts of the United States, which was the same picture I had found here. Well, by this time I was dragging my feet, not because I believed that fluoridation would do any great harm, because I was still quite believed that it was perfectly safe, it couldn't possibly harm anyone, but if it wasn't giving the benefit which we thought it would give, what was the point in campaigning for it? And in fact, the teeth seemed to be, when I compared similar kinds of communities, like similar low-income communities, the teeth seemed to be better in the non-fluoridated part. But as I found later, there was more tooth mottling, more disfiguring dental fluorosis caused by ingesting fluoride in the fluoridated part. So what was the point of campaigning for something like that? However, it wasn't until some of my staff drew my attention to this kind of mottling that was occurring with increasing frequency in Auckland children. A mottling of the teeth along the growth lines of the enamel, symmetrical, same on each side of the mouth, which answers the description of dental fluorosis, the kind of chronic poisoning, a sign of chronic poisoning caused by fluoride ingestion. And when I had a look at the children's teeth, I found teeth like these, mottled with some of the brown discoloration which is characteristic of the severe degree of this disease. So I should have had these ready for you, Paul.
That's okay.
There's another one, you see. Now, I reported this to my superiors, who just wiped the idea away. It couldn't possibly be fluoride. Fluoride doesn't do that. Fluoride only causes very mild mottling in a tiny minority of children. So I did a survey before I retired. This was now in the year before my retirement at the end of 1983. And so I did a survey, a large-scale survey. In fact, I examined all the children in the non-fluoridated area because it was a smaller populated area, and a large number in the fluoridated area with the assistance of my staff. And this material was eventually published, but it showed that a quarter of the children in fluoridated Auckland had this kind of mottling, dental fluorosis, which the early literature described as a sign of chronic fluoride poisoning.
Now, what's your response to scientists or dentists in the United States, and I think in Britain, who claim that this kind of staining is caused by tetracycline?
Well, that's an absolute nonsense. Tetracycline staining is a quite different appearance, absolutely different. Now, if you read reputable text on dental fluorosis, there is only one cause of this particular kind of mottling. Bilateral, diffuse mottling along the growth lines of the enamel. No other cause has been demonstrated but ingestion of fluoride. And the propaganda ruse that is being resorted to tell people an outright lie that there can be other causes of this condition is just that, lying propaganda. I could not persuade my superiors to do anything about this situation. And finally, I appeared on national television and showed them these pictures of the children. I had the children there, I brought the television camera into the clinics and we took pictures of the teeth and we showed the nation what fluoride was doing to the children's teeth. Of course, that did cause an uproar.
That must have been tough for you to do, John, because you had been promoting this and you were essentially saying, hey, here's the result of what I've been doing myself.
Well, when you work in a health service and promoting the health of children, in my case the oral health of children, and you suddenly discover that what you've been doing has been poisoning those children, that was the crucial point in my career when I became publicly opposed toward fluoridation. I then went on to study other aspects, and I learned that there are many other harmful effects for which there is a great deal of evidence, perhaps not conclusive proof, but if there is strong evidence or even the possibility of other forms of harm, how can you possibly justify advocating giving a dose to everyone in the community, old people, young people, infants, the whole lot, in the water supply, when there is some possibility of harm as well as this mottling of the teeth. I came to realise that what I should have realised much earlier, that common sense tells us that if a poison circulating in a child's body can cause a disturbance in the formation of its tooth enamel, it is very, very likely to cause other harm to other parts of the body, and there is now growing evidence that this is so. Now, I was now publicly opposed to fluoridation. I had retired, and I wrote to the Auckland Regional Authority, which was the authority responsible for our water supply, and I stated in a letter that I believed it is possible that the damage was not only to the children's teeth but to their bones, to their skeleton. And this was ridiculed. Scorn was poured on this suggestion. My colleagues said that the only possible effect, deleterious effect of fluoride was this mottling, that couldn't possibly have 1 part per million in the water get any other effects. Well, 6 years later, the first of the studies, there have now been about 7 of them, the first of the studies appeared which reported an association between increased hip fractures in the elderly and water fluoridation. And as I say, there have now been 7 studies reporting this association. And what has surprised me most, Paul, is the stubbornness with which my colleagues cling to their belief. Not all, there are some honourable ones who have stated over and changed their stance, but they don't get much publicity, and the majority of the profession are still thoroughly committed, almost like a religious belief, to belief in this procedure of water fluoridation. The answer to this evidence of an association between fluoridation and hip fractures, well, for a start, they produced some other studies, but they were much smaller scale studies, and in my case are less convincing, showing no such association. But they asserted that an association doesn't establish a cause. And these were only, they said, epidemiological studies, which cannot be taken as proof that fluoridation is causing this condition of increased fractures. But I found that appearing at about the same time, there were clinical studies showing that fluoride, when used in an attempt to treat the condition of osteoporosis, that's the rarefaction of bones in mostly elderly women, that carefully controlled clinical trials had shown that fluoride did cause more hip fractures in these patients who were given the fluoride. So we know that fluoride is only partly excreted. Any fluoride you taken is partly deposited in the bones and the rest excreted. And over a long period of time, the levels of fluoride in old people's bones have shown to be the same as occurs with this treatment for osteoporosis, with higher doses for short periods. So there is evidence of a causative link. There's long been a debate about the possible cancer-causing effect of fluoride. But the most recent and most telling evidence, I think, was about 5-6 years ago, studies reported that in male rats there was an increase in the rare bone cancer called osteosarcoma, which affected the males and not the females. And again, my colleagues rubbished this and said, oh, but that's only equivocal evidence, it doesn't necessarily relate to human beings. And almost immediately it became apparent from data collected by the National Cancer Institute in the United States, collected from every cancer registry in the United States, covering 10% of the entire population, that this same rare bone cancer, osteosarcoma, had increased in young males and not in the non-fluoridated areas. It increased in fluoridated areas and not in the non-fluoridated areas. Now that animal experiment showing that effect, followed by epidemiological studies showing a relationship between increased osteosarcoma and water fluoridation, it is claimed it is not conclusive evidence. Well, maybe it's not. No, it seems pretty strong evidence to me, but even if it's not conclusive, it has to be admitted that the possibility is there. Now, I know mothers whose sons have died from osteosarcoma, teenage boys. Is one death of a teenage boy from osteosarcoma an adequate exchange for saving a part of a cavity in a child's tooth? And I think when you put that issue to the lay public, they're mostly common sense people, and they say no. If there's the slightest possibility of harm, we shouldn't be adding it to the water, even if it does prevent cavities for which there is now considerable doubt.
Just to follow up on the osteosarcoma story, I understand that I think it was Dr. Colquhoun in New Jersey did a 7-county study and a 3-county study in New Jersey, and they found a considerable increase. 3 to 7 times more osteosarcoma in the fluoridated areas of New Jersey than in the unfluoridated areas. And yet Dr. Colquhoun, who is a public health official, went on to say that this is not conclusive evidence and we should carry on with fluoridation. Now, when we point out this evidence that there has been this association, our opponents reply by saying, oh, but the authors who produced this data said that we should carry on with fluoridation. But that is the opinion of those authors. The data presented by those authors
which cannot be evaded, will be interpreted differently by a person who's not a keen fluoridationist. And actually, again, common sense tells us if there is an increase in osteosarcoma in fluoridated areas, and animal experiments have indicated a link, a causative link, it amazes me how we can carry on adding it to the water supply. I do know instances of professionals who have confided to me that they agree with me, and then later on I find them taking a public pro-fluoridation position. And the intimidatory pressures are very strong. I can understand that when your career's ahead of you and you have a family to support and a house mortgage to pay, the pressures are very strong to perhaps shut up. But I do not understand how they can go on publicly advocating something when they're intelligent people who know that they're advocating something which must be wrong. I'm afraid what happened was that the fluoridation became more a matter for propaganda than for science, and the fluoridation propaganda revelled in putting over the story. It was a PR exercise par excellence. They put over the story that the people opposing it were crackpots. There was that movie that
Dr. Strangelove
was in, Dr. Strangelove, showing the crackpot right-wing general raving on about fluoride. Now that was all a part of the exercise. But when you go and look at the history of it, that's not so. It's sure the John Birch Society and the other right-wing groups supported that, but I could point to extreme groups that supported establishment orthodox positions too. That doesn't prove anything. You don't judge a thing by who is saying what. You judge a thing on the actual evidence that's before your eyes. And as I put it to my colleagues, look, here we have before our eyes the situation in New Zealand where teeth are just as good with or without fluoridation, and we have more mottling where there's water in the fluid. Why don't you judge your position on the evidence before your eyes? But I'm afraid in professions there's a tendency to rely on the textbooks that you read on your training and what your precious authorities, the people of course whose reputation is on the line and have a vested interest in defending the orthodoxy, they listen to them rather than use their own thinking powers. I feel that professional education leaves much to be desired in promoting independent thinking.
You know, one of the things I also find striking is an incredible double standard between the nitpicking that goes on with the epidemiological studies which may suggest that we have a serious health problem on our hands, and those original studies which have been quoted again and again and again. I read Dr. Philip Sutton's work from Australia. Was it Mark Diefenbach?
Mark Diefenbach, yes. Now, it was an interesting experience I had there, Paul. When I went to Brisbane, the Lord Mayor set up a task force, and I gave a submission to that task force on the issue of fluoridation. Brisbane's the one capital city in Australia which is never fluoridated. And Professor Webb from the medical school, Donald Webb, was there advocating fluoridation, and I had given a submission against it. And after me, Professor Webb spoke using all these what you call nitpicking arguments for the evidence of harm. And at question time, I asked Professor Webb, why do you not apply the same rigid standards for finding a causative link to the pro-fluoridation studies which claim that water fluoride reduces tooth decay? And do you know what his answer was? And it's on the record, it's in the minutes of that task force meeting. He said, I have never studied the fluoridation studies, he said, because I have never been asked to. And yet he had made a submission to the task force advocating the fluoridation of Brisbane's water supply. And he admitted to us, he admitted to the task force that he had never read or studied the studies on which that fluoridation procedure is based.
Now, in your particular case, you looked at in fine detail, with an enormous amount of data, what was happening in New Zealand. Yes. Meanwhile, we have some other, if you like, more common sense type data from around the world. very few countries actually fluoridate.
Yes.
I mean, half the people drinking fluoridated water actually live in the United States.
Yes.
We have 10%, I think, in Britain,
Yes.
60% in Ireland,
Yes.
but most other European countries
Yes.
do not fluoridate.
No, no.
And based on what I've read, and I'd like to get your reaction to it, there isn't an evidence that the whole countries that are not fluoridating, have worse teeth than countries that are fluoridating.
No, actually, the evidence we have indicates that the decline in tooth decay has been greater in those countries which have not fluoridated than it has been in countries like the United States and Britain, to a limited extent, and the United States to a great extent, have fluoridated. And I really believe Professor Teosha in India has a point. He found, over a period of 30 years, he and his colleagues examined 400,000 children's teeth in India, and he found that the opposite to what is usually believed is the case, that the more fluoride there was, the more decay. And that was exactly the finding of Professor Steerlink in Tucson, Arizona, that when they looked at all the children's teeth in Tucson, the more fluoride there was in their neighborhood, in their water supply, the more cavities they had in their teeth. So it could be that it's been an even bigger blunder than we thought, and that in some societies it actually has a reverse effect and worsens teeth rather than makes them better.
Well, now I'm hoping that citizens who get hold of this videotape in the United States and possibly elsewhere, who are dealing with dentists who go in front of the public and say fluoride is definitely good for teeth and there is no evidence whatsoever that it causes any health problems. What would you say to those dentists? What would be your message to American dentists who, for probably good intentions, no evil implied, no devious implications, what would you say to those dentists?
Well, some opponents of fluoridation get very angry and say they're liars because it's obviously not true that there is no evidence. There is evidence. What they mean is that there's no convincing evidence to them. But to say there's no evidence, of course, is untrue. But I think they, well, as I once was, they're sincerely misled and misguided, and they really believe in. But if you cross-examine them and they don't like that, they always run away from debate. One hallmark of the fluoridationists is they run away from debate. I didn't when I was a fluoridation. I seemed to get away with it, but I wouldn't like to be doing it today because the evidence has become much stronger against fluoridation than it was when I was young. I think that the professional education they receive conditions them to accept their authorities rather than make independent judgments themselves. You know, they're taught that this is the accepted orthodoxy. This is what our experts say is the case, and it's a state of mind which I think shows a defect in the nature of our professional education. I think the American Dental Association and the American Medical Association are about to face a massive loss of credibility because of their stubborn support of orthodoxies that are long overdue, long past. You haven't asked me anything about the Hastings fluoridation experiment.
Oh, well, yes. Okay, well, tell us about the Hastings fluoridation.
So that was interesting. You see, fluoridation started in my country following an experiment. It was first of all called, later it was called a project, but because people in Hastings didn't like being experimented on. But the Hastings fluoridation experiment was started in 1952. It started. The fluoride was added to the water supply there in late 1953 or 54. There's a little debate about when it started. But the experiment was reported in the New Zealand Dental Journal and is now cited in all the textbooks around the world, one of the pro-fluoridation studies. And of course I had believed it. It showed a dramatic up to 70-80% reduction in tooth decay after the introduction of fluoridation. But when I got to the stage where I was re-examining the whole situation, because I was convinced that fluoridation did more harm than good, I used our official information legislation to get from the health department their files dating back to that period and right up to the present. The fluoridation files of the New Zealand Department of Health. And I must say that was one of the biggest surprises in my life when I read them, because they revealed that in carrying out the experiment, the school dentists in Hastings had been instructed to change their method of diagnosing tooth decay. Now, the initial exams were done under the old method of diagnosis, when the teeth were heavily filled, and immediately the experiment started. They used a different method of diagnosis. They didn't call it a cavity until it pierced through the enamel. They used to fill it at the early stage, just a little catch in the enamel. And the measurement was number of decayed, missing, filled teeth. Now, that instruction was carried out by the school dentist because they were under firm instructions. It was a tightly controlled discipline service. So it was quite clear why there was a dramatic sudden reduction in the reported levels of tooth decay in Hastings. Also, the neighbouring town of Napier had been called the ideal control because it had the same water supply but without fluoride added to it. And after the first stage of the experiment, they found that there were fewer cavities, even despite the change of diagnosis in Hastings. Despite that change, which brought about a dramatic reduction, there was still less tooth decay in the control city, which had not been fluoridated, than there was in the fluoridated one. And so they dropped the control because they said it wasn't a suitable control after all. And you know, they came up with a lovely excuse. They had discovered that there was a previously unknown trace element, molybdenum, in some of the soil in the control city. And this must have caused this dramatic reduction in tooth decay, much lower than in the rest of New Zealand. Now, all the evidence I've looked for cannot substantiate that molybdenum story. And moreover, Napier was no different to the rest of New Zealand, and decay went on declining there as it did in the rest of New Zealand, but that fact was kept from the New Zealand public. They were told that it was fluoridation in Hastings which was causing them, and that all the other places must fluoridate, and they dutifully did. Not all of them, but about 50% of them. And I published that information in The Ecologist, an international environmental journal, and they've never been able to refute that finding which I found. It was, in effect, a rigged experiment, and that leads me to wonder how many of the other early fluoridation trials were carried out under similar circumstances. The person who carried out the experiment, now dead, it came straight from the States, where he'd been taught there how to carry out fluoridation trials. Came from New Zealand, took over in Hastings and finished the experiment. The person who started the experiment in Hastings, Dr. Eric Hewitt, had said at the outset that he had an open mind and he wasn't fully convinced by the evidence from the United States. And the chairman of the committee which supervised that experiment, an appointee of the New Zealand Dental Association, said to me, and I interviewed him, "John, we had to get rid of Hewitt." And there are letters by him saying Hewitt was not a fluoridationist.
Now,
so Hewitt resigned and the trained fluoridator from the States took over.
Wow.
So that was a jack-up. It was a contrived result, if anything was, and it's been shown to be so. But despite that, I've got the files, I've got photocopied all the files, I can produce them. And one wonders how many, if you could get that sort of information from the other trials in the States, just how much. I don't say that the person who carried out the experiment was a conscious crook. I think they were so bedazzled by this marvellous thing from America, which they were convinced that they had to get the same result. And the chairman of the committee said to me, we were determined to repeat in New Zealand what had happened in the States. We got the result, he said with pride. And I've never explained that in that change of diagnosis which brought about the supposed decrease was not mentioned in any of the published accounts of the study.
One of the problems that we have, and this, in my local area we have this problem, we have friends, 40s, in their 40s and 50s, and they say, my kid's grown up in this town, his teeth is great, my teeth were awful,
Yes.
and I'm convinced that fluoride did it. What do you say to people like that?
Well, you can say what the fluoridators say about the evidence of harm, that an association does not prove a cause.
Yeah.
I point out that the same story, the same thing has happened in our one city, big city, which did not fluoridate, Christchurch. In fact, when I looked at the treatment statistics throughout New Zealand, the children in Christchurch had better teeth than in the cities which had fluoridated.
Yes.
So, why are you convinced, I would say, that it's fluoride that caused your reduction in your children's teeth? When in only Hunga and Auckland, which did not fluoridate, there's been the same reduction. In Christchurch, there's been the same reduction. In Europe, where they've never had fluoridation, there's been a bigger reduction than has happened in the fluoridated plate countries. So, why do you keep believing it? And when I say that, they say, oh, well, yes, perhaps you know more about it than I do, or something like that. You know.
Well, what do you think has caused the improvement of children's teeth then around the world?
Well, in New Zealand, the figures available from the New Zealand School Dental Service show that the decline in tooth decay had actually started before fluoridation was introduced. And I think during that period, the only association I can find was a change in dietary patterns. The introduction of household refrigeration meant people were consuming more fresh foods than they did before. They were eating their vegetables in a fresher state. And actually, the one survey that's been carried out in New Zealand on changes in dietary patterns show that we eat 2 to 3 times more per head of fresh fruit and vegetables than we did back in the 1930s. So that's a big change. Also, the consumption of cheese has increased 8-fold, and cheese has been shown to have an anti-decay factor in it. So I think it's more likely you'll find the change in nutrition and diet is a more rational explanation than the introduction of fluoride. I think what fluoride has done is only bedevil the situation and slow up the process rather than speeding it up. Of course, there is another factor, and that is that with all diseases you find unexplained changes in the pattern of the disease. Diseases have had their wave and then they've declined, and nobody knows quite why. It could be that populations develop a certain degree of immunity to particular diseases, and that could have happened with tooth decay as well.
What about brushing of teeth? Has the quality of getting education gone up with standard of living?
Well, that's been an effect of the school dental service. As it became more comprehensive, of course, it was carrying out education, telling children about cleaning teeth. And I think that, and in the poorer sections of our community now, a lot of our immigrant population and poorer sections where tooth decay is again worsening, there is that knowledge of oral hygiene and possibly not the knowledge of dietary patterns, but it's a very complex question, the causes of rise and fall of different diseases.
Another quick personal question. You got a PhD late in life? Is that true?
Yeah, when I retired, I went to, I tutored at the University of Auckland, and I completed a PhD on the subject of fluoridation. Yes. But on the educational aspects, because that interested me. I was curious to know how the education of these people had made them so oblivious to new evidence. I think another explanation, of course, is the insularity of the medical and dental professions. I find that they have very little knowledge of literature outside their own particular discipline. They don't know very little about environmental studies or veterinary studies and other disciplines, chemistry and so on, which if they had that broader outlook, they would be more open-minded, I think. But by keeping themselves insular, It's a bit like a religious sect which reinforces itself by meeting within its own little cliques and reinforcing each other.
You mentioned fluoride and the International Society for Fluoride Research. Tell us a little bit about that organization, how it came about, and the journal Fluoride.
Well, the International Society for Fluoride Research was founded by a group of international researchers, mainly under the instigation of Professor Dr. George Warbot. It was in 1967, I think, or 68. The first journal came out in 1968. And these scientists were aware of the need for international communication because there was a lack of communication. And it has persisted continuously since then, publishing research. It is listed in all the scientific indices, like the only one it's not in is Index Medicus, and its database, of course, is Medline, which is the one used by most English-speaking medical people. It is in the European Excerpta-Medica, which is sort of the European equivalent, I guess, of Index Medicus, which might explain why European medics are a little bit more better informed. But the thing about Medline is it's controlled by the United States Public Health Service, which is a partisan in the fluoridation controversy.
Oh, very strong.
And they have never given a reason for excluding fluoride from its list of journals. So I think it's the situation was a kind of censorship, really, but I think it's being got around now because with the new computerized databases you can search for all the indices in one go, and so even though Medline excludes something, you'll get to pick it up somewhere else. So we've broken through that barrier too, and it continues to receive for publication very high quality research in a whole range of disciplines. It's not just medical and dental, it includes that, but it's chemistry, veterinary science, and various environmental issues, environmental science and so on.
Now you very gently rapped my knuckles for suggesting it was anti-fluoride. In fact,
well,
you've got...
It's often accused of being anti-fluoride, but George Warbot himself, and I'm trying to honour his memory here, was most insistent that it is not an anti-fluoridation journal. It's a scientific journal for publishing research. And pro people are willing to, welcome to submit research so long as the research stands up to peer review the same as the others do. And I have actually published work by pro-fluoridation science since I've been editor. What I have introduced are certain innovations, a discussion section where these scientific issues can be discussed. And there again, the pro people, Professor Jenkins has submitted quite a lot and it's been published, and he's a leading pro-fluoridation professor in England. So we do aim to publish both sides of the controversy, believing that that's the best way to get at the truth.
Yes.
Now, I think it's often accused of being an anti-fluoride journal because the first editor and now me are well known as opponents of fluoridation, but we have done what our colleagues in the medical and dental professional literature do not do. We are willing to publish both sides of the question, which they are not prepared to do. I find when I try to submit things to the orthodox medical and dental journals, I might get something in, but it's always cut off before I can finish off a discussion, and they do things like not correcting misprints and so on. So I think that our record as a scientific journal is better than the pro-fluoridation journals are. We're more open about it.
John, as a newcomer to this issue, I've only been involved a couple of years, but I have been involved in other issues where I've seen people attacked because they don't hold the orthodox position. I want to thank you on behalf of lots and lots of people in our country and around the world who have admired your courage for saying, I had one position, I think I was wrong, and now I've got a different position. That takes a lot of courage, I think.
I didn't mention that one of the reasons why I was able to do it, where my colleagues haven't, I've always been interested in history, and actually my PhD is in a history subject, history of education. And it was long after I graduated in dentistry, I also finished degrees in history studies. And my special interest was the history of science. And that is, of course, is riddled with examples of orthodoxies being eventually overthrown and examples of the rigidity of those who adhere to orthodox positions. And I think that helped me to examine my own conduct. And I suddenly realised, look, you're just behaving the same way those fellows away back in the days of Copernicus were behaving. And so I went back to square one and just pretended I wasn't pro-fluoride. I looked at the evidence afresh. But it seems that medical and dental graduates, by and large, are not capable of doing that. And a lot in other disciplines too, I'm afraid. We're a minority who are prepared to re-examine. But I think all scientific progress really depends on those who do the re-examining. Otherwise, where do you get?
Well, John Colquhoun, thank you very, very much indeed.
I hope I performed all right.
You have done wonderfully well.
And what has surprised me most, Paul, is the stubbornness with which my colleagues cling to their belief. Not all, there are some honourable ones who have stated over and changed their stance, but they don't get much publicity, and the majority of the profession are still thoroughly committed, almost like a religious belief, to belief in this procedure of water fluoridation. Intimidatory pressures are very strong.